From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Our homes, our nation, all the things we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Cold War was an era of history marked by geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their allies in the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, spanning from 1947 to 1991. This war was surrounded by existential threats of constant nuclear threats, spying, and both major CIA and KGB intelligence trying to get as much information as possible on each other. And disclaimer before we start. If a YouTube employee or government employee is watching this video, all of this information in this video is public and easily accessible by everyone on the internet. So don't get mad at me for anything in this video because, like I said, it is all public. And also, shout out to End Time Teacher 7486 for this video idea. And if you want to be shouted out in a future video, then comment video ideas down below and I may choose yours. And okay, I'm excited to get into this video, so welcome to the Cold War Iceberg Explained. And actually, before we get into the video, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the channel's goal to be at 250,000 subscribers before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. So please consider subscribing. Thanks, alright, now into the video. Tier 1. Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was a metaphorical and physical boundary that divided Europe into two separate areas during the Cold War, coined by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in a speech delivered in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. The term symbolized the ideological and political divide between Western Europe under the influence of democratic capitalism led by the United States and Eastern Europe, dominated by communist regimes aligned with the Soviet Union. Physically, the Iron Curtain was represented by a series of border fortifications, walls, fences, and watchtowers erected by the Soviet Union and its satellite states to prevent the movement of people and ideas between East and West. The most famous of these structures was the Berlin Wall, built in 1961 to stem the flow of East Germans fleeing to the democratic West. Ideologically, the Iron Curtain represented the stark contrast between the political and economic systems of the two blocs. In the West, individual freedom, democracy, and free market capitalism flourished, while in the East, authoritarianism, one-party rule, and state-controlled economics characterized life beyond the Iron Curtain. The division created by the Iron Curtain led to decades of tension, proxy wars, and the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Iron Curtain in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era of global politics. Overall, the Iron Curtain was not just a physical barrier, but also a powerful symbol of the ideological, political, and economic divide that defined the Cold War era. Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 stands as one of the most perilous moments in the history of the Cold War. It was a tense, 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, sparked by the discovery of Soviet ballistic missile deployment in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the shores of Florida. The crisis began when U.S. reconnaissance aircraft captured photographic evidence of Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. This discovery led President John F. Kennedy to implement a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments and demanded the removal of the missiles already in place. The world held its breath as tensions escalated, and for several days, it seemed that nuclear war was imminent. Both superpowers engaged in intense diplomatic negotiations, with Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev exchanging letters to defuse the situation. Ultimately, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret promise to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis was averted, and both sides claimed victory, but it left a lasting impact on international relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and the need for effective communication and diplomacy between rival nations in times of heightened war. United States. The United States played a central role in the Cold War, emerging as one of the two superpowers alongside the Soviet Union after World War II. Throughout the conflict, the U.S. pursued a policy of containment, seeking to prevent the spread of communism and protect its interests and allies around the world. Economically, the United States experienced unprecedented growth and prosperity during the Cold War era. Fueled by technological innovation, industrialization, and consumerism, the country's economic power was a crucial element of its global influence and served as a contrast to the centrally planned economics of the communist bloc. Militarily, the United States built up its military capabilities to deter Soviet aggression and maintain a position of strength in the global balance of power. This included the development of nuclear weapons, the establishment of military alliances such as NATO, and we'll get into NATO later down and I'll explain that more in depth, and the deployment of troops and military assistance to conflicts and crises around the world. Politically, the United States championed democracy, individual freedoms, and human rights as alternatives to the authoritarianism of the Soviet Union and its allies. American leaders, including Presidents Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan, articulated a version of America as a beacon of liberty and democracy, rallying support for the U.S. position in the Cold War. Culturally, the United States also exerted significant influence during the Cold War era, exporting its music, movies, and popular culture to audiences around the world. This cultural diplomacy helped shape perceptions of America and its values, reinforcing the image of the United States as a dynamic and innovative society. Overall, the United States was a dominant force in shaping the course of the Cold War, using its economic, military, political, and cultural power to advance its interests and contain the spread of communism. And we'll get into the USSR, the other half part of the Cold War, right now in the next entry. USSR. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR, was the other major superpower during the Cold War, representing the communist bloc and serving as the primary rival to the United States and its allies. Led by the Communist Party under figures such as Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, and Leonid Brezhnev, the USSR pursued an ideology of Marxist-Leninism and sought to spread communism worldwide. Economically, the USSR operated under a centrally planned economy, with the state controlling the means of production and distribution. While the Soviet economy achieved significant industrialization and military power, it struggled to match the economic prosperity and technological innovation of the United States and other Western countries. Militarily, the USSR built up a formidable military force, including a massive army, a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons, and a powerful navy. The Soviet Union also formed military alliances with other communist states, such as the Warsaw Pact, to counter the influence of NATO and the United States in Europe. Politically, the USSR maintained strict control over its citizens and suppressed dissent through censorship, propaganda, and repression. The Communist Party wielded absolute power, and political opposition was not tolerated. Internationally, the USSR sought to spread communism through both ideological persuasion and military intervention. This led to Soviet involvement in conflicts such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and various proxy wars in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Culturally, the USSR promoted socialist realism as the official artistic style, emphasizing the glorification of communist values and the achievements of the Soviet state. However, the regime also faced challenges from dissent, artists, and intellectuals who sought greater freedom of expression. Ultimately, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 officially marked the end of the Cold War because the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Korean War. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, was one of the major conflicts of the Cold War, pitting the communist forces of North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union, against the democratic forces of South Korea, backed by the United Nations coalition led by the United States. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces under the leadership of Kim Il-sung launched a surprise invasion on South Korea, aiming to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. The United Nations quickly condemned the invasion and authorized military intervention to repel the North Korean aggression. The United States played a leading role in the conflict, providing the bulk of the UN forces and military support to South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur commanded the UN forces and orchestrated a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, which turned the tide of the war in favor of the UN forces. However, the intervention of Chinese troops in the late 1950s in support of North Korea escalated the conflict into a full-scale war. The Korean War became a bloody and just bad stalemate, with intense fighting along the 38th parallel, the dividing line between North and South Korea. The war ended in an agreement signed on July 27, 1953, which established a demilitarized zone, otherwise known as DMZ, along the 38th parallel and formally ended hostiles. However, no peace treaty was ever signed, and technically, the Korean Peninsula remains in a state of war to this day. The Korean War has profound political, social, and economic consequences. It solidified the division of Korea into two separate countries, North and South Korea, with contrasting political systems and ideologies. It also underscored the global significance of the Cold War and the willingness of the superpowers to intervene militarily to contain the spread of communism. Moreover, the Korean War had a devastating human cost, with millions of casualties and widespread destruction and suffering. It left a legacy of bitterness and division on the Korean Peninsula, which continues to be a big part of politics in the Koreas. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, which lasted from 1955 to 1975, was one of the most significant and controversial conflicts of the Cold War era. It was a protracted struggle between the communist forces of North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the anti-communist government of South Vietnam, backed by the United States and its allies. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the post-World War II period, when Vietnam, a former French colony, was divided into two separate states along the 17th parallel: Communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and anti-communist South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other Western powers. The conflict escalated in the 1960s as the United States increased its military involvement in an effort to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. American military advisors were sent to South Vietnam to assist in the fight against the communist insurgency, but their presence quickly grew into a full-scale military intervention. The United States employed a combination of conventional warfare, aerial bombardment, and counterinsurgency tactics to defeat the communist forces and support the South Vietnamese government. However, the war proved to be far more difficult and costly than anticipated, with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas demonstrating resilience and tenacity. The Vietnam War deeply divided American society and sparked widespread protest and anti-war movements at home. The conflict also strained relations with key allies and led to the reassessment of U.S. foreign policy priorities. In 1973, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords, which called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. However, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam, ultimately resulting in the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, to communist forces in April 1975. The Vietnam War has had profound and far-reaching consequences. It cost the lives of millions of people and left Vietnam deeply scarred by the violence and destruction. It also led to the re-evaluation of U.S. foreign policy and military strategy, prompting a shift away from interventionist policies and towards a more cautious approach to international conflicts. And if you want to know more about the Vietnam War, I did make a Vietnam War Iceberg not too long ago, so if you want to, check that out. If not, that's cool. Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, which we did talk about earlier with the Iron Curtain, but anyways, the Berlin Wall was a physical and ideological barrier that divided the city of Berlin into East and West from 1961 to 1989. It was a concrete manifestation of the broader division between the Communist Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, and the Democratic Western Bloc, led by the United States. The construction of the Berlin Wall began on August 13, 1961, as the East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, sought to stem the flow of East Germans fleeing to the West. The wall consisted of a series of concrete barriers, guard towers, barbed wire, and other fortifications stretching for 155 kilometers or 96 miles around West Berlin, effectively cutting off the western part of the city from East Germany. The Berlin Wall became a powerful symbol of the Cold War division between communism and capitalism, freedom and oppression. It represented the physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain, separating families, friends, and communities overnight. Over the years, attempts to cross the Berlin Wall were met with harsh reprisals from East German border guards, including shooting and arrests. Despite the risks, many East Germans attempted to escape to the west, either by climbing over the wall, tunneling under it, or using improvised devices such as hot air balloons and zip lines. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, marked a really pivotal moment in world history and symbolized the end of the Cold War era. The collapse of the wall was the result of a combination of different forces and factors, including growing internal pressure for reform within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, as well as peaceful protests and demonstrations by citizens demanding greater freedom and democracy. The fall of the Berlin Wall led to the reunification of Germany and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, signaling the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era of world history. Today, the Berlin Wall stands as a symbol of the triumph of freedom over oppression and serves as a reminder of the divisions of the past. Communism. Communism is a socio-political and economic ideology that advocates for the collective ownership of the means of production and the just completely getting rid of private property. In its ideal form, communism aims to create a classless society where wealth and resources are distributed equally among all members of society, where each individual contributes according to their abilities and receives according to their needs. The roots of communism can be traced back to works of philosophers such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who outlined their ideas in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Marx believed that capitalism inherently led to exploitation and inequality, and he envisioned communism as the inevitable outcome of historical class struggles. In practice, communism has been implemented in various forms by different countries around the world, with mixed results. The Soviet Union, led by figures like Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, adopted a form of communism known as Marxism-Leninism, which emphasized centralized control by the state and the establishment of a vanguard policy and party to lead the proletariat to revolution. Other countries such as China, Cuba, and Vietnam have also embraced communism, albeit with adaptations to fit their own culture, political, and economic context. These adaptations have often resulted in variations such as Maoism, Castroism, and Ho Chi Minh thought, each with its own distinctive characteristics and policies. While communism has been associated with authoritarian regimes and human rights abuses, proponents argue that it has the potential to create a more just and equitable society by eliminating class distinctions and ensuring the welfare of all citizens. Critics, however, contend that communism undermines individual freedom, stifles innovation and economic growth, and leads to widespread poverty and oppression, which it does. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decline of communism as a global ideological force, communist parties and movements continue to exist in various parts of the world today, advocating for social justice, workers' rights, and the redistribution of wealth. While the practical feasibility of achieving a truly communist society remains a subject of debate, the ideals of communism continue to influence political discourse and social movements around the world. Capitalism played a very important role in the dynamics of the Cold War, serving as a central tenet of the ideology espoused by the United States and its allies. At its core, capitalism is an economic system characterized by private ownership of the means of production, free market competition, and profit maximization. Throughout the Cold War, the United States championed capitalism as a superior alternative to communism, arguing that it promoted individual freedom, innovation, and prosperity. One of the primary arguments put forth by capitalist notions during the Cold War was the idea that economic freedom was inseparable from political freedom. They contended that allowing individuals to own property, start businesses, and pursue wealth without government interference led to a more vibrant and dynamic society. This contrasted sharply with the centralized command economics of communist states, where the state controlled all economic activity. Capitalism also served as a cornerstone of the Western alliance system during the Cold War. The United States and its NATO allies prompted capitalist principles not only as an economic system, but also as a bulwark against the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan, for example, provided economic assistance to Western European countries to help rebuild their economies after World War II and prevent the spread of Soviet influence. Moreover, the capitalist system fueled technological innovation and economic growth, enabling the West to outpace the Soviet bloc in terms of living standards and material wealth. The space race, which we will get into later down the iceberg, but the space race, just for an example, became a symbol of the competition between capitalism and communism, with the United States demonstrating its technological prowess through achievements such as the Apollo moon landings. In conclusion, capitalism was not merely an economic system during the Cold War, but a foundational element of the ideological struggle between East and West. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, played a significant role in shaping the course of the Cold War during his time in office from 1961 to 1963. His presidency was marked by a series of pivotal events and decisions that tested the resolve of the United States in its struggle against the Soviet Union. Kennedy's approach to the Cold War was characterized by a combination of strategic containment and diplomatic engagement. He inherited a tense international situation from his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, with ongoing crises such as the Cuban Revolution, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the escalating conflict in Vietnam. So Kennedy was definitely just thrown into a lot of hard conflicts starting off his presidency. One of Kennedy's most famous Cold War confrontations came in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, Kennedy faced the most perilous moment of his presidency. Through a combination of diplomacy, brinkmanship, and a naval blockade of Cuba, Kennedy successfully forced the Soviets to withdraw their missiles, averting a potential nuclear conflict. Kennedy's administration also pursued a policy of flexible response, which aimed to match the United States military capabilities to the level of aggression exhibited by the Soviet Union. This approach contrasted with the previous policy of massive retaliation advocated by Eisenhower and allowed for a more nuanced and tailored response to Soviet things that caused them to provoke them. In addition to his confrontations with the Soviet Union, Kennedy also sought to promote American ideals and values abroad through initiatives such as the Alliance for Progress, which aimed to foster economic development and democracy in Latin America. Although, tragically, Kennedy's presidency was cut short by his assassination in November 1963, leaving many of his Cold War initiatives unfinished. The space race. The space race was a defining feature of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through the 1960s, it was a competition for supremacy in space exploration driven by political, military, and ideological factors. The space race officially began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit around the Earth. This achievement stunned the world and marked the Soviet Union's technological prowess, sparking fear in the United States for falling behind in the arms and space race. In response to Sputnik, the United States intensified its efforts to catch up and surpass the Soviet Union in space exploration. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy committed the nation to the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade, setting the stage for the Apollo program. The rivalry reached its peak in 1969 when NASA's Apollo 11 mission successfully landed astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, although, all the conspiracy theories talking about how they didn't land on the moon, but that's up to you. Let me know what you think down in the comments below if you think they actually landed on the moon. But anyways, this fulfilled Kennedy's goal and demonstrated American technologically superiority. This historic achievement was a significant propaganda victory for the United States and marked the pinnacle of the space race. Throughout the 60s, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a series of milestones and achievements in space exploration, including the first human space flight by Yuri Gagarin in 1961, the first woman in space by Valentina Tereshkova in 1963, and the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov in 1965. Despite the intense competition, the space race has also had a positive implication for space, science, technology, and exploration. It spurred rapid advancements in aerospace engineering, computer technology, and material science, laying the groundwork for future space exploration endeavors. Ultimately, the space race served as a symbol of Cold War competition and technological innovation, shaping the trajectory of space exploration and leaving a lasting legacy on humanity's understanding of the cosmos. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, emerged as a cornerstone of Western security and defense strategy during the Cold War. Established in 1949, NATO was formed in response to the perceived threat posed by the expansionist policies of the Soviet Union and Europe following World War II. At its core, NATO was a collective defense alliance, with member states agreeing to mutual defense in the event of an attack on any one of them. This principle was enshrined in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, and each member pledges to come to the aid of the attacked member. During the Cold War, NATO served as a bulwark against Soviet aggression and expansionism in Europe. The alliance provided a framework for coordinating military planning, intelligence sharing, and joint exercises among its member states, thereby enhancing the collective security of the Western democracies. One of NATO's primary objectives during the Cold War was to deter Soviet aggression through a strategy of containment. This involvement maintaining a strong military presence in Europe, particularly along the Iron Curtain dividing East and West, to prevent the further spread of any sort of communism. NATO's military capabilities were bolstered by the integration of West Germany into the alliance in 1955, which provided a significant strategic advantage in the event of a conflict with the Soviet bloc. The deployment of American troops and nuclear weapons in Europe further underscored NATO's commitment to defending its member states. In addition to its military role, NATO also served as a forum for political cooperation and consultation among its member states. The alliance provided a platform for addressing common security challenges, promoting democratic values, and fostering transatlantic solidarity. With the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO underwent a period of transformation, expanding its membership and adapting to new security threats. However, its core mission of ensuring the security and defense of its member states remains as relevant today as it was during the Cold War. Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a military alliance established in 1955 by the Soviet Union and several Eastern European communist states in response to the formation of NATO. It served as a counterbalance to NATO's influence in Europe during the Cold War and played a significant role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the era. The creation of the Warsaw Pact was a direct response to West Germany's integration into NATO and its remilitarization of Western Europe. The Soviet Union sought to consolidate its control over its Eastern European satellite states and create a unified front against the perceived threat posed by NATO. The member states of the Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. These countries all pledged mutual assistance and cooperation in the event of an attack on any one of them, similar to the collective defense principle of NATO's Article 5. The Warsaw Pact played a very crucial role in solidifying Soviet control over Eastern Europe and maintaining political stability within the communist bloc. It provided a framework for military cooperation, joint exercises, and intelligence sharing among its member states, thereby enhancing the defense capabilities of the Eastern Bloc. One of the defining features of the Warsaw Pact was the presence of Soviet troops and military installations in Eastern Europe. These forces served as a deterrent to any potential aggression from NATO and ensured the Soviet Union's dominance in the region. However, the Warsaw Pact was not without its internal tensions and contradictions. The invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces in 1968 to suppress the Prague Spring reforms highlighted the Soviet Union's dominance within the alliance and strained relations with some member states. With the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, marking the end of its role as a military alliance. Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry S. Truman in a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947, was a pivotal moment in the early Cold War period. It articulated that the United States' commitment to containing the spread of communism and supporting nations threatened by Soviet expansionism, marking a significant departure from America's traditional isolationist stance. The immediate context of the Truman Doctrine was the crisis in Greece and Turkey, where communist insurgencies threatened to destabilize the region. Truman requested Congress to provide military and economic assistance to these countries to help them resist communist aggression. In his speech, Truman framed the conflict as a global struggle between democracy and totalitarianism, arguing that the United States had a moral obligation to support freedom-loving peoples against oppression. The Truman Doctrine laid the foundation for what became known as the policy of containment, which aimed to prevent the further expansion of Soviet influence in Europe and beyond. It signaled a shift in American foreign policy towards a more interventionist approach and marked the beginning of a significant U.S. involvement in international affairs. One of the key elements of the Truman Doctrine was its emphasis on economic aid as a tool of foreign policy. The subsequent implementation of the Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars in economic assistance to help rebuild Western Europe after World War II, was seen as a concrete manifestation of this policy of containment. The Truman Doctrine also had far-reaching implications for U.S. foreign policy beyond Europe. It established a precedent for American interventionism in regions perceived to be threatened by communism, leading to U.S. involvement in conflicts such as the Korean War and later conflicts during the Cold War period. Overall, the Truman Doctrine represented a fundamental shift in American foreign policy and set the stage for the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that defined the Cold War era. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader who transformed Cuba into a communist state and defied the United States for decades, was a central figure in the history of the Cold War. Born on August 13, 1926, Castro rose to prominence during the Cuban Revolution, which culminated in his overthrow of the Batista regime in 1959. Castro's rise to power was fueled by widespread discontent with the corrupt and repressive regime of Fulgencio Batista, as well as his own charisma, leadership skills, and commitment to social justice. Upon taking power, Castro implemented sweeping reforms aimed at reducing inequality, improving access to education and healthcare, and redistributing land to the poor. However, Castro's revolutionary government quickly came into conflict with the United States, which viewed his regime as a threat to its own interests in the region. The nationalization of American-owned businesses and the establishment of diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union heightened tensions between Cuba and the United States, leading to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis in particular brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and underscored the intensity of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union and his willingness to confront the United States made Cuba a focal point of Cold War tensions in the Western Hemisphere. Throughout the Cold War, Castro remained a thorn in the side of successive U.S. administrators, supporting revolutionary movements and socialist governments across Latin America and Africa. His defiance of American hegemony and his ability to survive numerous assassination attempts and economic sanctions earned him admiration among some and condemnation among others. After nearly 5 decades in power, Castro stepped down as Cuba's leader in 2008 due to health issues, handing over the reins to his brother, Raul Castro. Fidel Castro's legacy remains deeply divisive, with supporters lauding him as a champion of social justice and anti-imperialism, while critics condemn his authoritarianism and human rights abuses. Regardless of one's perspective, Castro's impact on the Cold War era and on Cuba's history is undeniable. Cold War Espionage. Cold War espionage was a shadowy and pervasive aspect of the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both sides engaged in elaborate and clandestine intelligence operations to gather information, conduct sabotage, and undermine each other's interests, and we'll get into a lot of the operations further down in the iceberg. The world of espionage during the Cold War was characterized by intricate plots, double agents, and high-stakes covert operations. One of the most notorious intelligence agencies during the Cold War was the Soviet KGB, otherwise known as the Committee for State Security, which operated a vast network of spies and informants around the world. The KGB's activities ranged from infiltrating Western governments and military institutions to conducting espionage operations in allied countries and within the Soviet bloc itself. Likewise, the United States had its own intelligence agencies, such as the Central Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as the CIA, which engaged in counterintelligence efforts to thwart Soviet espionage and gather intelligence on Soviet activities. Espionage during the Cold War took many forms, including traditional espionage, which is just spying on military installations and gathering classified information, covert action, which is sabotage and subversion, and disinformation campaigns, which is just spreading false information to deceive and confuse the enemy. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recruited spies from all walks of life, including diplomats, scientists, journalists, and even ordinary citizens. One of the most famous espionage cases of the Cold War was the Cambridge Five, a group of British spies who infiltrated the highest levels of the British government and intelligence establishment on behalf of the Soviet Union. Similarly, the CIA and the KGB engaged in a relentless battle of wits, recruiting double agents and running moles within each other's organizations. The proliferation of nuclear weapons and the constant threat of mutual assured destruction during the Cold War heightened the importance of intelligence gathering and analysis. Both sides sought to gain strategic advantage by acquiring information about each other's military capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Espionage during the Cold War was a dangerous and high-stakes game, with the lives of agents often hanging in the balance. Despite the end of the Cold War, espionage remains a central feature of international relations, albeit in a changed and evolving form, reflecting the enduring legacy of the era of geopolitical rivalry and mistrust. Tier 2. Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev, a central figure in the Soviet Union during the Cold War era, played a significant role in shaping both domestic and international policies. Born on April 15, 1894, in Kolinovoga, Russia, Khrushchev rose through the ranks of the Communist Party to become one of its most prominent leaders. Khrushchev came to power following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, and he initiated a process of de-Stalinization, denouncing the excesses and crimes of the Stalin era. This period saw a relaxation of his oppressive policies that had characterized Stalin's rule, including the release of political prisoners, reforms in the criminal justice system, and a degree of cultural liberalization. Internationally, Khrushchev's leadership was marked by a confrontational stance towards the United States and its allies, as well as by efforts to expand Soviet influence around the world. He famously engaged in a war of worlds with U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower during the Kitchen Debate in 1959, where he defended the superiority of communism over capitalism. One of the most defining moments of Khrushchev's tenure was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Khrushchev's decision to deploy nuclear missions to Cuba in response to the presence of U.S. missiles in Turkey escalated tensions beyond the superpowers and nearly resulted in a catastrophic confrontation. However, Khrushchev ultimately backed down and agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island nation. Khrushchev's leadership style was characterized by a mixture of boldness and unpredictability, which sometimes led to tensions within the Soviet leadership. His efforts to modernize the Soviet economy through agriculture and industrial reforms, such as the Virgin Lands Campaign and the introduction of corn cultivation, met with mixed success. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from power in a coup orchestrated by his political rivals within the Communist Party leadership. He spent the remaining years of his life in relative obscurity until his death on September 11, 1971. Despite his eventual downfall, Khrushchev's legacy as a key figure in the Cold War era and as a reformer within the Soviet Union remains a subject of debate among historians and political analysts. De-Stalinization and Khrushchev thaw. De-Stalinization and Khrushchev thaw were both pivotal processes initiated by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that significantly altered the course of Soviet history and the trajectory of the Cold War. De-Stalinization, which began after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, involved a comprehensive re-evaluation of Stalin's policies, a denunciation of his personality cult, and a relaxation of the oppressive measures that characterized his rule. Khrushchev aimed to distance the Soviet Union from Stalin's brutal legacy while pursuing reforms to modernize the Soviet system and improve the standard of living for its citizens. One of the most dramatic aspects of de-Stalinization was the re-evaluation of Stalin's crimes and the rehabilitation of his victims. Khrushchev's famous secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 condemned Stalin's purges, the cult of personality surrounding him, and the abuses of power within the Soviet leadership. This speech marked a turning point in Soviet history and paved the way for a more open and critical examination of the past. The Khrushchev thaw refers to a period and relative political and cultural liberalization that accompanied de-Stalinization. It saw the relaxation of censorship, the release of political prisoners, and a greater degree of artistic freedom. Writers, artists, and intellectuals took advantage of this newfound openness to explore previously taboo subjects and challenge the orthodoxies of the Stalinist era. Internationally, the Khrushchev thaw led to a thawing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the West. Khrushchev's willingness to engage in dialogue with Western leaders, such as his visits to the United States and Western Europe, signaled a departure from Stalin's confrontational approach and raised hopes for improved relations between the superpowers. However, the Khrushchev thaw was not without its limitations and contradictions. Khrushchev's reforms faced resistance from conservative elements within the Soviet leadership, and its efforts to modernize the economy and agriculture met with mixed results. Moreover, the relative liberalization of the thaw was often accompanied by periods of renewed repression and crackdowns on dissent. In conclusion, de-Stalinization and Khrushchev thaw were both complex and multifaceted processes that had profound implications for Soviet society, politics, and international relations. While they represented a break from the repressive excesses of the Stalin era and offered glimpses of a more open and humane Soviet system, they also revealed the inherent contradictions and limitations of attempting to reform a deeply entrenched authoritarian regime. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, served from 1981 to 1989 and played a pretty significant role in shaping the final years of the Cold War. Born on February 6, 1911, in Illinois, Reagan began his career as an actor before transitioning into politics. Reagan's presidency was marked by a conservative political agenda and a commitment to limited government, free market economics, and a strong national defense. He pursued a confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union, famously labeling it as an evil empire and advocating for a robust military buildup to counter Soviet expansionism. One of Reagan's most significant Cold War policies was the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as the SDI, also known as Star Wars, which aimed to develop a missile defense system capable of intercepting and destroying incoming ballistic missiles. While SDI was criticized as technologically unfeasible and destabilizing, it nonetheless contributed to the increasing pressure on the Soviet Union and fostering negotiations for arms reduction treaties. Reagan's approach to the Cold War also included diplomatic engagement with Soviet leaders, most notably through the series of summit meetings with General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. These summits and meetings included the historic meeting in Geneva, Riga, and Moscow, paved the way for arms control agreements, and marked a significant thaw in US-Soviet relations, so these meetings just helped out the relationship between the two countries. Reagan's presidency coincided with several key events that hastened the end of the Cold War, including the Solidarity movement in Poland, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. While Reagan's politics and rhetoric undoubtedly contributed to the pressure on the Soviet Union, historians continue to debate the extent of his role in precipitating its downfall. Beyond its Cold War policies, Reagan's presidency left a lasting impact on American politics and society. His conservative ideology, often referred to as Reaganism, reshaped the Republican Party and influenced subsequent generations of conservative leaders. Chernobyl Disaster. The Chernobyl disaster, which occurred on April 26, 1986, was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history and had far-reaching consequences for both human health and the environment. It took place at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the Soviet Union at the time. The disaster was caused by a combination of design flaws in the RBMK reactor, human error during a safety test, and a lack of overall safety protocols. During the test, operators attempted to simulate a power outage and test the reactor's ability to continue cooling itself without external power. However, a series of errors led to a sudden surge in power, triggering a steam explosion that ruptured the reactor vessel and released a large amount of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was catastrophic, with fires burning for days and a plume of radioactive fallout spreading across much of Europe. The nearby town of Pripyat, home to the plant's workers and their families, was evacuated, and a large exclusion zone was established around the plant to restrict access to the contaminated area. The Chernobyl disaster had profound consequences for human health and the environment. Thousands of people, including plant workers, firefighters, and cleanup crews, were all exposed to high levels of radiation, resulting in acute radiation sickness, long-term health effects, and an increased risk of cancer. The full extent of the health impact remains a subject of debate and ongoing study. The environmental consequences of the Chernobyl disaster were also significant. Large areas of land were contaminated with radioactive isotopes, rendering them uninhabitable for years to come. Wildlife populations in the affected areas suffered, with some species experiencing genetic mutations and population declines. In addition to its immediate impact, the Chernobyl disaster had broader implications for nuclear safety and public perception of nuclear power. It led to a reassessment of safety protocols and design standards for nuclear reactors worldwide and contributed to the decline in public support for nuclear energy. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is still exclusion, so it's still dangerous and off limits to this day, showing how much of a danger this was to everyone around it. Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan stands as a pivotal initiative in the post-World War II era, deeply intertwined with the dynamics of the Cold War. Proposed by U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall in 1947, it aimed to aid the economic recovery of Western European countries devastated by the war. This plan wasn't just about charity, it was a strategic move in the context of growing tensions with the Soviet Union. At its core, the Marshall Plan sought to prevent the spread of communism in war-torn Europe by fostering economic stability and prosperity. By providing substantial financial assistance amounting to over $12 billion, which is equivalent to over $100 billion today, the United States aimed to rebuild infrastructure, revive industries, and stabilize currencies in recipient countries. One key aspect of the Marshall Plan was its requirement for European nations to cooperate in their recovery efforts, promoting unity and integration. This cooperation not only facilitated economic recovery, but also served American interests by creating a stronger Western Europe capable of resisting communist influence. However, the Marshall Plan also exacerbated tensions with the Soviet Union. Stalin viewed it as a tool of American imperialism and barred Eastern Europe countries under Soviet control from participating. Instead, he established the Molotov Plan, also known as the Commission, to provide economic assistance to Eastern Bloc countries, further solidifying the division of Europe into the spheres of influence. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, left an indelible mark on the Cold War era through his policies, diplomacy, and the Watergate scandal. Nixon's presidency spanned from 1969 to 1974, a period marked by significant Cold War events and tensions. One of Nixon's most notable contributions to Cold War history was his policy of détente, a strategy aimed at easing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Through diplomatic efforts such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, otherwise known as SALT, and the signing of arms control agreements within the Soviet Union, Nixon sought to reduce the risk of nuclear confrontation and foster a more stable relationship between the two superpowers. The Nixon administration's approach to détente was characterized by pragmatic recognition of the limits of confrontation and the need for dialogue. Nixon's foreign policy initiatives extended beyond the Soviet Union to include China, a major player in the Cold War. In 1972, Nixon made a historical visit to China, opening a door to normalized relations between the United States and the People's Republic. This diplomatic relationship and breakthrough not only reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Asia, but also had broader implications for the balance of power in the Cold War. However, Nixon's presidency was marred by the Watergate scandal, a political crisis that ultimately led to his resignation in 1974. The Watergate scandal, involving illegal activities by Nixon's administration to undermine political opponents, eroded public trust in the presidency and damaged the credibility of the United States on the global stage. Despite the tarnish of Watergate, Nixon's legacy in shaping Cold War diplomatic efforts endures to this day. His efforts to pursue Detente with the Soviet Union and engage with China left a lasting impact on international relations, contributing to a more stable and interconnected world during a turbulent period of the Cold War. Revolutions of 1989. The revolutions of 1989 were a series of largely peaceful uprisings that swept across Eastern Europe, leading to the collapse of communist regimes and the end of the Cold War division of Europe. These revolutions marked a monumental shift in the political landscape of the continent and had far-reaching implications for global politics. The domino effect of these revolutions began in Poland in 1989 with the semi-free elections that resulted in a landslide victory for the Solidarity movement, challenging the communist regime's legitimacy. This event emboldened dissent movements throughout Eastern Europe, inspiring citizens in many other countries to demand political reform and democratic freedoms. One of the most significant moments of the revolutions occurred in East Germany, where mass protests led to the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. The dismantling of this iconic symbol of the Cold War division symbolized the end of the Soviet domination in Eastern Europe and paved the way for German reunification. The revolution spread rapidly to other countries in the region, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, where communist governments either collapsed or were peacefully ousted from power. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution saw the overthrow of the communist regime led by Václav Havel, while in Romania, the regime of Nikita Khrushchev was violently overthrown in the Romanian Revolution. The revolutions of 1989 had profound implications for the global balance of power, signaling the triumph of liberal democracy over authoritarian communism. The dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the subsequent disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the official end of the Cold War era and the beginning of a new chapter in world relations. Overall, the revolutions of 1989 were a very important moment in modern history, symbolizing kind of the end of the Cold War era and the freedom opening up in a lot of other countries. Solidarity movement, which we briefly just talked about, but let's just get into it a bit deeper. The Solidarity movement was a very pivotal force in the history of Poland and played a crucial role in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Formed in 1980, Solidarity was the first independent trade union in a Warsaw Pact country and quickly became a powerful social and political movement. Led by Lech Walesa, Solidarity emerged in response to the economic and political grievances of Polish workers, who faced deteriorating living standards and government repression under the communist regime led by General Wojciech Górski. The movement's demands included greater workers' rights, political reforms, and the recognition of independent trade unions. Solidarity's strength lay in its broad-based support, encompassing workers, intellectuals, and the Catholic Church. So this was just led and supported by a lot of people, which provided moral and material assistance to the movement. Its ability to mobilize mass demonstrations and strikes posed a significant challenge to the communist authorities and inspired similar movements across Eastern Europe. In 1981, Solidarity was banned by the Polish government, and its leaders, including Walesa, were arrested. However, the movement continued to operate underground, organizing resistant activities and maintaining its influence among the Polish population. The turning point came in 1989 when the Polish government, facing mounting pressure from Solidarity and international actors, agreed to negotiate with the opposition. This led to the historic Round Table Talks, which paved the way for semi-free elections and the gradual transition to democracy in Poland. In June 1989, Solidarity won a landslide victory in the partially free elections, securing a majority of seats in the newly established Senate and a significant presence in the Sejm, which is the lower house of parliament. This marked the first time a communist regime had peacefully relinquished power to a non-communist government in Eastern Europe. Solidarity's success in Poland had a ripple effect across the region and basically half the continent, inspiring similar movements in other Warsaw Pact countries and contributing to the broader wave of democratic revolutions that swept Eastern Europe in 1989. Overall, the Solidarity movement was instrumental in breaking the grip of communism in Poland and laying the groundwork for the country's transition to democracy. Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, the eighth and final leader of the Soviet Union, played a very important role in shaping the final years of the Cold War and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Empire, so maybe he wasn't that good of a leader. And anyways, his tenure as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991 marked a period of profound political, economic, and social transformation known as the Perestroika, which is restructuring, and Glasnost, which means openness. Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 kind of created a new era of Soviet leadership characterized by a willingness to reform the stagnant political and economic system. He recognized the urgent need for change to address the Soviet Union's deep-seated problems, including economic stagnation, political repression, and internal isolation. Perestroika aimed to modernize and revitalize the Soviet economy by introducing elements of market-oriented reforms, decentralizing economic decision-making, and encouraging private enterprise. However, all of these reforms faced resistance from entrenched interests within the party and bureaucracy, leading to economic turmoil and social unrest. Glasnost, or openness, was another key aspect of Gorbachev's reform agenda, aimed at fostering greater transparency, political debate, and intellectual freedom within Soviet society. This policy allowed for a more open exchange of ideas, the relaxation of censorship, and greater media freedom, leading to a flowering of cultural and intellectual expression. Internationally, Gorbachev pursued a policy of new thinking and sought to improve relations with the West through diplomatic initiatives such as arms control agreements and summit meetings with Western leaders. His willingness to engage in dialogue and negotiate in good faith contributed to the thaw in Cold War tensions and helped to defuse the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite Gorbachev's efforts to reform the Soviet system, his policies ultimately unleashed forces that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Economic chaos, nationalist movements, and political upheaval in the Soviet republics undermined the authority of the central government, leading to the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991. While Gorbachev's legacy is a subject of debate among historians and analysts, he was widely credited with initiating the process of democratic reform and peaceful transition in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War, spanning from 1945 to 1949, was a protracted and bloody conflict between the Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party, otherwise known as the CCP, led by Mao Zedong. The outcome of this conflict determined the political future of China and had far-reaching consequences for the country's development and its role in the Cold War. The roots of the Chinese Civil War can be traced back to the power struggles and ideological differences between the KMT and the CCP, which emerged during the early 20th century amid the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Despite cooperating against common enemies such as warlords and Japanese invaders during World War II, the two parties had fundamentally different visions of China's future. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, the resumption of hostiles between the KMT and the CCP quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war. The conflict was characterized by large-scale military campaigns, guerrilla warfare, and political maneuvering as both sides vied for control over territory and resources. The KMT, backed by the United States and other Western powers, initially enjoyed significant military and financial support. However, its forces were plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and low morale, while the CCP's guerrilla tactics and grassroots support base allowed it to gain ground in rural areas. The turning point of the Civil War came in 1949 when the CCP launched a successful offensive that culminated in the capture of Beijing and the establishment of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of the KMT retreated to Taiwan, where they established a separate government that claimed to be the legitimate ruler of all of China. The victory of the CCP in the Chinese Civil War had very big implications for China's domestic politics and its role in the Cold War. Under Mao Zedong's leadership, the new communist government embarked on a radical program for social and economic transformation, including land reform, collectivization, and industrialization. Internationally, the establishment of the People's Republic of China led to the realignment of global geopolitics as the United States and its allies shifted their recognition and support to the KMT government in Taiwan. the Chinese Civil War also contributed to the broader ideological and geopolitical struggles of the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union vied for influence in East Asia. In summary, though, the Chinese Civil War was a complex and pretty complicated conflict that shaped the course of modern Chinese history and had significant implications for the global balance of the power during the Cold War era and, influenced how China is today in today's modern world. The nuclear arms race. The nuclear arms race during the Cold War was a defining aspect of the geopolitical landscape, shaping international relations and security policies for decades. Following the development and use of atomic bombs by the United States to end World War II, the Soviet Union accelerated its own nuclear weapons program, leading to a period of rapid proliferation and innovation in nuclear technology. Both superpowers sought to maintain a strategic advantage by expanding their nuclear arsenals and developing more advanced delivery systems, such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, otherwise known as ICBMs, and strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads. This escalation led to the production of increasingly powerful and sophisticated nuclear weapons, including hydrogen bombs, which far surpassed the destructive capabilities of the atomic bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The arms race was driven by a doctrine of deterrence, wherein each side sought to deter the other from initiating a nuclear conflict by maintaining a credible threat of retaliation. This strategy, known as mutual assured destruction, otherwise known as the MAD strategy, relied on the belief that the consequences of a nuclear war would be so catastrophic that neither side would risk launching a first strike. However, the pursuit of nuclear superiority also fueled fears of accidental or inadvertent nuclear escalation, as well as concerns about the possibility of a preemptive strike triggering a devastating global conflict. This heightened sense of insecurity led to diplomatic efforts to negotiate arms control agreements and establish mechanisms for crisis communication and confidence-building measures between the superpowers. Key milestones in the nuclear arms race included the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war, as well as various arms control agreements, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, armed at reducing the risk of nuclear confrontation and limiting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Ultimately, the end of the Cold War saw significant reductions in nuclear arsenals and a shift towards arms control and disarmament efforts. Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion stands as one of the most notorious episodes of the Cold War, representing a failed attempt by the United States to overthrow the Cuban government and its leader, Fidel Castro. The invasion unfolded in April 1961 and had far-reaching problems for U.S. and Cuban relations, regional dynamics in Latin America, and the broader Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The roots of the Bay of Pigs invasion can be traced back to the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which brought Fidel Castro to power and led to the establishment of a communist regime in Cuba. Concerned about the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, began to support Cuban exiles who opposed Castro's government and sought to overthrow him. The invasion itself was carried out by a force of around 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, who landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. The plan was to foment a popular uprising against Castro and establish a beachhead from which the exiles could rally support and ultimately overthrow the government. However, the invasion quickly faltered due to a series of strategic blunders and miscalculations. The element of surprise was just lost, and the Cuban military, backed by Castro's government and supported by Soviet advisors, swiftly defeated the invading force within days. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating setback for the United States and a propaganda victory for Castro, who used this incident to solidify his grip on power and strengthen ties with the Soviet Union. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion saw heightened tensions between the United States and Cuba, as well as increased Soviet involvement in the Caribbean region, including the deployment of ballistic missiles to Cuba, which precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. MKUltra, and once again, CIA or government employee or YouTube employee watching this video, this is all public information. Public information. Anyone can access this. So anyways, let's get into MKUltra. MKUltra remains one of the most infamous and controversial covert operations in United States history. illustrating the lengths to which intelligence agencies went during the war and during the Cold War era in pursuit of psychological and chemical interrogation techniques. Conducted by the CIA from the early 1950s through the mid-1970s, MKUltra aimed to develop mind control techniques, including the use of drugs such as LSD and other methods to manipulate mental states and behavior. The project operated under extreme secrecy, with experiments conducted on unwitting subjects, including civilians, prisoners, and military personnel, often without their consent or knowledge. The project's origins can be traced back to the Cold War anxieties about espionage, brainwashing, and the perceived need to counter Soviet and Chinese interrogation techniques. However, MKUltra quickly spiraled into a morally dubious and scientifically questionable endeavor, marked by unethical experimentation and human rights abuses. One of the most notorious aspects of MKUltra was its use of LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic drug, in experiments aimed at studying its effects on behavior and consciousness. These experiments often involved administering LSD to subjects without their consent, leading to traumatic experiences and long-term psychological harm for many participants. Because, imagine you're chilling one day, get picked up by the CIA, and get drugged by LSD. Definitely traumatic. The revelations of MKUltra's existence and the extent of its activities in the 1970s, including congressional investigations and public hearings, sparked outrage and calls for greater oversight of intelligence agencies. In 1975, the Church Committee, a U.S. Senate committee, uncovered details of MKUltra and other covert operations, leading to reforms and increased scrutiny of government intelligence agencies and activities. The legacy of MKUltra continues to raise profound ethical and legal questions about the balance between national security imperatives and individual rights of citizens. Tsar Bomba. The Tsar Bomba, also known as Big Ivan, stands as one of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever detonated. Developed by the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War arms race, this hydrogen bomb represented the pinnacle of nuclear weapons technology and served as a chilling reminder of the absolute destructive potential of thermonuclear weaponry. On October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union conducted the test of Tsar Bomba over the remote Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya. The bomb had a yield of approximately 50 megatons, equivalent to 50 million tons of TNT, which is just insane. And this made it the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated. To put this into perspective, the explosive power of the Tsar Bomba was approximately 3,000 times greater than that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. The Tsar Bomba was so massive that it had to be dropped from a specially modified bomber aircraft, and even then, it required a parachute to slow its descent down to allow the aircraft and its crew to escape to a safe distance. So this thing was just ridiculous. The detonation of the bomb produced a fireball with a diameter of about 8 kilometers or 5 miles and a mushroom cloud that rose to an altitude of nearly 70 kilometers or 43 miles. The test of the Tsar Bomba sent shockwaves around the world and underscored the terrifying potential for nuclear devastation in the event of a full-scale nuclear conflict between the superpowers. Which is just, this just highlights, why would you ever need a bomb that big? Come on, those things are just unnecessary for human existence. A bomb that is so big, it goes 43 miles into the sky with its mushroom cloud? Ridiculous. Why do weapons like that even exist? McCarthyism. McCarthyism refers to a political and social phenomenon that emerged in the United States during the early years of the Cold War, characterized by the intense anti-communist fervor and the persecution of individuals suspected of communist sympathies or affiliations. Named after Senator Joseph McCarthy, who became the face of the movement, McCarthyism had far-reaching implications for American society, politics, and civil liberties. The origins of McCarthyism can be traced back to the late 1940s and the early 1950s, a time of heightened anxiety in the United States over the perceived threat of communism both domestically and abroad. The spread of communism in Eastern Europe, the victory of Mao Zedong's communist forces in China, and the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons all contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion. Senator McCarthy rose to prominence in 1950 when he claimed to possess a list of names of individuals working in the State Department who were all allegedly members of the Communist Party or sympathetic to communist ideology. This marked the beginning of a highly publicized campaign in which McCarthy and his supporters conducted investigations, hearings, and trials, all aimed at rooting out supposed communists from the government, academia, and media, and other sectors of society. McCarthy and his allies employed tactics such as guilt by association, heresy, and unsubstantiated accusations to smear individuals and destroy their reputations and careers. The fear of being labeled a communist or a fellow traveler led to a climate of conformity and self-censorship, as people sought to avoid being targeted by McCarthy witch hunts. The impact of McCarthyism was profound, leading to widespread hysteria, the erosion of civil liberties, and the stifling of political dissent. Thousands of people were investigated, interrogated, and blacklisted, with many people losing their jobs or facing some other form of persecution. The entertainment industry, in particular, was heavily affected by McCarthyism, with the Hollywood blacklist resulting in the blacklisting of numerous actors, directors, writers, and other industry professionals. However, McCarthy's downfall came relatively swiftly, as his tactics and behavior came under increasing scrutiny and criticism. In 1954, McCarthy's influence began to wane following televised hearings into his conduct, during which he was exposed as a bully. The Senate ultimately censored McCarthy, leading to his political downfall and the eventual decline of McCarthyism as a potent force in American politics. Although McCarthyism faded from the forefront of American politics by the late 1950s, its legacy endured, leaving a lasting imprint on American society and politics. Tier 3. Nixon's Madman Theory. Nixon's Madman Theory was a strategic approach to international relations employed by U.S. President Richard Nixon in his administration during the Vietnam War. The basic premises of the Madman Theory was to project an image of unpredictability and irrationality to adversaries, particularly the North Vietnamese and their allies, in order to intimidate them into making concessions at the negotiating table. The theory was rooted in the belief that if Nixon could convince the North Vietnamese leadership that he was capable of extreme actions, such as escalating the conflict to nuclear warfare or expanding the war into neighboring countries like Laos or Cambodia, they would be more inclined to negotiate on terms favorable to the United States. To implement the Madman Theory, Nixon and his advisors engaged in a series of provocative actions and statements intended to convey an image of recklessness and unpredictability to the North Vietnamese. This included public threats of military escalation, secret bombing campaigns, and other secret operations aimed at disrupting enemy supply lines. Additionally, Nixon deliberately cultivated a persona of strategic ambiguity, leading adversaries to question his intentions and fear the potential consequences of challenging U.S. resolve. However, the effectiveness of the Madman Theory remains a subject of debate. While some argue that it played a role in influencing North Vietnamese decision-making and ultimately contributed to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, others contend that the theory had limited impact and may have even escalated tensions unnecessarily. Nevertheless, it's a sort of interesting strategy that was attempted by Richard Nixon. Détente. Détente, a French term meaning relaxation, refers to a period of reduced tension and improved diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Emerging in the late 60s and lasting through much of the 70s, détente represented a shift away from the confrontational stance of the early Cold War years toward a more cooperative and pragmatic approach to managing the superpower rivalry. Several factors contributed to the onset of détente. One key driver was the recognition by leaders on both sides of the Cold War divide that the arms race and ideological confrontation were unsustainable and risked catastrophic consequences for both nations and the world at large. Additionally, domestic pressures such as the Vietnam War for the United States and economic stagnation for the Soviet Union created incentives for de-escalation and negotiation. Détente was characterized by a series of diplomatic initiatives and agreements aimed at promoting cooperation and reducing the risk of direct confrontation. One of the most significant events of the détente era was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which resulted in treaties aimed at curbing the proliferation of nuclear weapons and establishing limits on strategic missile systems. Another notable aspect of détente was increased cultural and economic exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as efforts to expand cooperation in areas such as space exploration and environmental protection. These exchanges helped to humanize the enemy in the eyes of the public and fostered greater understanding between the two superpowers. However, détente was not without its challenges and setbacks. Conflicts such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the continued proxy wars in regions like Angola and Nicaragua strained relations and undermined the spirit of cooperation. Additionally, domestic political changes such as the election of more hawkish leaders in both the United States and the Soviet Union contributed to the eventual unraveling of détente by the late 70s and early 80s. Evil Empire Speech. The Evil Empire Speech refers to a pivotal address delivered by U.S. President Ronald Reagan on March 8, 1983 in Orlando, Florida. In this speech, Reagan used stark and uncompromising language to denounce the Soviet Union, labeling it as an evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
In sharply criticizing its ideology and actions on the world stage, Reagan's use of the term evil empire was emblematic of his administration's hardline stance against communism and his unwavering commitment to confronting Soviet expansionism and promoting democracy and freedom. The speech marked a significant rhetorical escalation in the rhetoric of the Cold War, reflecting Reagan's belief in the moral superiority of the United States and the righteousness of its cause in opposing the Soviet Union. In the speech, Reagan condemned the Soviet Union for its suppression of human rights, its support for totalitarian regimes, and its aggressive military posture, which I guess are all pretty valid claims. He warned against the dangers of appeasement and urged Americans to remain vigilant in the face of the Soviet threat. Star Wars program, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The Star Wars program, officially known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as the SDI, was a proposed missile defense system announced by U.S. President Ronald Reagan in a televised address on March 23, 1983. The initiative aimed to develop a sophisticated network of space-based lasers and particle beams capable of intercepting and destroying incoming nuclear missiles, thereby providing a shield against potential Soviet missile attacks. Yeah, he wanted a space-based laser system to shoot out nuclear missiles. That's just insane sounding, but kind of cool. Reagan's announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative was a bold and ambitious move, reflecting his administration's commitment to advancing American military technology and bolstering the nation's defense capabilities. The initiative was also seen as a response to growing concerns about the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal and the possibility of a nuclear warfare. The Strategic Defense Initiative quickly became a focal point of controversy and debate, both domestically and internationally. Critics argued that the technology required for such a system was highly speculative and basically just impractical, and that the initiative could potentially escalate the arms race and undermine efforts to achieve arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. Despite all of these criticisms, the Strategic Defense Initiative had significant implications for U.S.-Soviet relations in the course of the Cold War. The announcement of the initiative heightened tensions between the two superpowers and prompted a renewed focus on military competition and technological innovation. The Soviet Union, already burdened by its own economic and military challenges, responded with alarm to the prospect of an American missile defense system that could potentially neutralize its nuclear deterrent. The Strategic Defense Initiative also played a role in shaping the rhetoric and diplomacy of the Cold War. Reagan's unwavering support for the initiative, coupled with the confrontational rhetoric towards the Soviet Union, contributed to the perception of him as a resolute and uncompromising leader. This perception was further solidified by Reagan's famous challenge to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in his speech delivered at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin on June 12, 1987.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Which was the famous Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Reagan's call for the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, which symbolized the division between East and West, captured the spirit of the era and underscored the moral imperative of freedom and democracy. While Reagan's challenge was not directly related to the Strategic Defense Initiative, it reflected the broader theme of American resolve in confronting the Soviet Union and advancing the cause of liberty. In the end, the Strategic Defense Initiative did not fully materialize as originally envisioned, due to technological challenges and shifting strategic priorities. However, its legacy as a symbol of American ingenuity and determination, as well as its impact on US-Soviet relations during the late Cold War period, remains significant. 1960 U-2 Incident. The 1960 U-2 incident was a very important event during the Cold War that severely strained relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. On May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile while conducting a reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory. The U-2 aircraft was part of a top-secret CIA program aimed at gathering intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, particularly its nuclear arsenal and missile sites. The high-altitude reconnaissance flights conducted by the U-2 were intended to provide the United States with valuable information about Soviet military activities and capabilities. The downing of the U-2 aircraft by the Soviet Union was a major embarrassment for the United States and a significant setback for its intelligence gathering efforts. The incident exposed the vulnerability of American reconnaissance aircrafts to Soviet air defense and highlighted the risks inherent in conducting covert operations deep within enemy territory. Although, in the immediate aftermath of the incident, the United States initially denied that the U-2 aircraft was engaged in espionage, claiming that it was on a weather reconnaissance mission. You have to admit, it was a nice try by the United States trying to cover it up. However, when the Soviet Union produced evidence of the downed aircraft and captured pilot, the Eisenhower administration was forced to admit the true nature of the mission. The U-2 incident sparked a major international crisis and brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of conflict once again. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev denounced the United States and suspended diplomatic talks with the Eisenhower administration. The incident also complicated efforts to improve relations between the two superpowers and reignited Cold War tensions. The Eisenhower administration faced intense domestic and international pressure to respond to the Soviet provocation. Ultimately, Francis Gary Powers was put on trial in the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison, although he was later exchanged for a Soviet spy captured by the United States. The U-2 incident had far-reaching consequences for US and Soviet relations and the conduct of the Cold War. It showed the dangers of aerial reconnaissance missions conducted over hostile territory and highlighted the need for improved intelligence gathering techniques. Laika SR-71. Laika was a Soviet space dog who became one of the first animals to orbit the Earth. On November 3, 1957, she was launched aboard the spacecraft Sputnik 2 by the Soviet Union, and we'll get into Sputnik 2 later down on the iceberg and explain that more deeply. But anyways, Laika's journey marked a significant milestone in space exploration, as she was the first dog and the first living being to orbit the Earth in history. Unfortunately, Laika did not survive the mission, as the technology to safely return spacecraft from orbit had not yet been developed. Nevertheless, her sacrifice did pave the way for future human spacecraft missions and spaceflight missions, and contributed valuable data to scientists studying the effects of space travel on living organisms. Shoe banging incident. The shoe banging incident refers to an event involving Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, during the 902nd plenary meeting of the United Nations General Assembly on October 12, 1960. This incident occurred during a speech by the Filipino delegate Lorenzo Sumulong, who criticized Soviet policies and actions in Eastern Europe. As Sumulong spoke, Khrushchev became increasingly agitated and interrupted the session multiple times to express his disagreements. At one point, he reportedly took off one of his shoes and began banging it on the desk in front of him as a sign of protest and disdain for Sumulong's remarks. Khrushchev's shoe-banging gesture was widely interpreted as a display of anger and frustration, of course, and it attracted significant attention from the media and delegates present at the General Assembly. This incident became emblematic of Khrushchev's confrontational style and his willingness to use unorthodox methods to assert Soviet power and influence on the world stage. While the shoe-banging incident itself may have been a spontaneous outburst of emotion from Khrushchev, it also reflected the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and just how stressed out, I guess, Khrushchev was during this meeting. Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip stands as a fascinating and controversial chapter in Cold War history. Following World War II, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated, Both sides sought to gain an advantage in scientific and technological expertise. Operation Paperclip was a covert program conducted by the United States Office of Strategic Services, otherwise known as the OSS, and later by the CIA. Its primary objective was to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including many who had been involved in the how do I say this? The operation was named Paperclip because of the paperclips attached to the dossiers of the scientists being recruited. The United States recognized the value of the knowledge and expertise possessed by these individuals, particularly in fields such as rocketry, aerospace engineering, and chemical warfare. Among the most notable recruits were Wernher von Braun, who played a crucial role in the development of the American space program, and Arthur Rudolph, who contributed to the development of the Saturn V rocket. However, the operation is not without controversy. Many of the scientists and technicians brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip had been directly involved in German activities during World War II, which included the use of forced labor from concentration camps, so these guys weren't good guys. Some critics argue that by recruiting these individuals, the United States effectively whitewashed their past crimes in the name of scientific and military advancement. Operation Paperclip's legacy is complex. While it undoubtedly contributed to the significant advancements in science and technology, particularly in the context of the Cold War space race, it also raises ethical questions about whether these guys should have been recruited or not, or just sent to jail, or, anything else you'd do to these really bad guys during World War II. Operation Mongoose. Operation Mongoose was a covert operation conducted by the United States government aimed at overthrowing the Cuban government led by Fidel Castro. It was initiated in the early 60s during the height of the Cold War, following the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which brought Castro to power and established a communist regime just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The primary goal of Operation Mongoose was to destabilize Castro's government through various different means, including sabotage, propaganda, and attempts to assassinate Castro himself. The operation was led by the CIA once again and involved collaboration with anti-Castro Cuban exiles and organized crime figures. One of the most infamous aspects of Operation Mongoose was the planning of covert operations intended to provoke unrest and overthrow the Cuban government. These operations included the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where a CIA-backed paramilitary force of Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro, but was swiftly defeated, and we talked about that earlier. Additionally, Operation Mongoose involved numerous attempts to assassinate Castro, ranging from poisoned cigars to exploding seashells. While none of these attempts succeeded in eliminating Castro, they showed the lengths in which the United States was willing to go in its efforts to remove him from power. Operation Mongoose ultimately failed to achieve its primary objectives of overthrowing the Castro regime. Instead, it actually intensified tensions between the United States and Cuba and contributed to the escalation of the Cold War. Once again, another failed CIA operation. "We will bury you" mistranslation. The phrase "we will bury you" is often attributed to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev during a speech he delivered in 1956 at the Polish embassy in Moscow. However, the context and translation of this statement has been the subject of debate and misunderstanding. The original Russian phrase spoken by Khrushchev was "My vos pokohomvim," which can be translated more accurately as "we will outlast you" or "we will be present at your funeral." The intended meaning was not a threat of physical burial, but rather a declaration of the Soviet Union's belief in the eventual triumph of communism over capitalism. The mistranslation of Khrushchev's statement led to widespread misconceptions in the West about Soviet intentions and fueled fears of imminent Soviet attack. Broken arrow accidents. Broken arrow accidents refer to the incidents involving accidental loss, theft, or detonation of a nuclear weapon or component. The term broken arrow was coined by the United States military to categorize such incidents and initiate specific protocols for response and recovery. These accidents represent some of the most serious and potentially catastrophic events associated with the Cold War era. One notable broken arrow incident occurred on January 17, 1966, when a B-52G bomber of the United States Air Force crashed near Spain during a mid-air refueling operation. The bomber was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, and 2 of them ruptured upon impact, scattering radioactive plutonium over the surrounding area. The accident prompted a massive cleanup effort by the US military and sparked international concern about the safety and security of nuclear weapons. Another infamous broken arrow incident took place on January 21st, 1968, when a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed onto sea ice near Thor Air Base in Greenland. Although the bombs did not detonate, the crash resulted in the dispersal of radioactive material and led to extensive environmental contamination. The cleanup efforts were complicated by the remote and harsh Arctic conditions. Broken arrow accidents highlight the inherent risks associated with the possession and maintenance of nuclear weapons. Despite stringent safety protocols and procedures, human error, mechanical failures, and unforeseen circumstances can lead to potentially catastrophic consequences with the nuclear weapons. Lost cosmonauts. The term lost cosmonauts refers to the alleged cases of Soviet cosmonauts who, according to various conspiracy theories, were sent into space but did not return alive, and their missions were subsequently covered up by the Soviet government. These theories emerged during the height of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. One of the most famous cases often cited by proponents of the lost cosmonauts theory is the alleged flight of Valentin Bonarenko in 1961. Bonarenko was a Soviet Air Force pilot selected for a cosmonaut training. According to some accounts, he was involved in a secret space mission that ended tragically when his spacecraft caught fire during a ground-based training exercise, resulting in his death. The Soviet government purportedly covered up the incident to maintain the appearance of a success in its space program. Another alleged lost cosmonaut is Grigory Nuruvodov, who was part of the original group of Soviet cosmonauts selected in 1960. Nuruvodov was dismissed from the cosmonaut program for disciplinary reasons, but some conspiracy theories suggest that he was actually sent on a secret space mission that ended in disaster, and he ended up getting lost in space, allegedly. Operation Northwoods. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation developed by the United States Department of Defense in the early 1960s during the Kennedy administration. The plan involved orchestrating various acts of terrorism and violence against American civilians and military targets, and then blaming these actions on the Cuban government. Yeah, the CIA was going to commit terrorist actions against American civilians. The ultimate goal was to create public support for military intervention in Cuba, potentially leading to the overthrow of Fidel Castro's communist regime. Some of the proposed actions in Operation Northwoods included: number 1, hijacking planes and blaming it on the Cuban agents. Number 2, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on their way to the United States. Number 3, conducting terrorist attacks in American cities and military bases, including bombings and shootings. Number 4, fabricating evidence to suggest Cuban involvement in these attacks. Yeah, the CIA wanted to do all this. Operation Northwoods was developed by senior Pentagon officials and presented to President Kennedy's administration in March 1962. However, the plan was ultimately rejected by Kennedy and his advisors due to ethical and practical concerns. Thank God for John Kennedy. The idea of staging attacks on American soil to justify military action was deemed too extreme and contrary to American values. While Operation Northwoods was never implemented, its existence became public knowledge decades later when declassified documents were released. The revelation of the plan sparked controversy and debate about the extent to which government officials were willing to go to achieve their geopolitical objectives during the Cold War. Operation Northwoods serves as a reminder of the potential dangers of unchecked government power and importance of transparency and accountability in democratic societies. And yeah, that one just always blows me away. It's crazy how they were actually considering that, and it got all the way to the president. But anyways, once again, all public information. Don't get mad at me, YouTube or government. Korean Airlines Flight 007. Korean Airlines Flight 007 was a commercial flight that gained international attention when it was shot down by Soviet interceptors on September 1st, 1983. The flight, a Boeing 747-200, was en route from New York City to Seoul, South Korea, with a layover in Anchorage, Alaska. Tragically, all 269 passengers and crew on board were killed, including many Americans. The aircraft deviated from its intended flight path and entered Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula, an area restricted to military aircraft. Despite attempts by Soviet air defense forces to communicate with the flight crew, KAL-007 continued flying deeper into Soviet territory, believing the aircraft to be a spy plane on a reconnaissance mission. Soviet fighter jets were dispatched to intercept and, ultimately, shoot down the civilian airliner. This incident sparked outrage, of course, and condemnation from the international community, particularly the United States and its allies. The Soviet Union initially denied any knowledge of the whereabouts of the aircraft, but later admitted to shooting down KAL-007, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity. The downing of KAL-007 intensified Cold War tensions once again and led to a breakdown in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The tragedy also prompted a re-evaluation of international aviation protocols and procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Tier 4. Operation Tamarisk. Operation Tamarisk was a covert intelligence operation conducted by Israel's Mossad in the 1950s and 60s. The operation's primary objective was to gather intelligence and facilitate the immigration of Jewish refugees, especially those from Arab countries, to Israel. It was part of a broader effort by Israel to strengthen its population and bolster its intelligence capabilities in the region. Operation Tamarisk involved different operations in various countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa, where Jewish communities faced persecution and discrimination. Mossad agents operated undercover, often posing as aid workers or businessmen, to identify and assist Jewish refugees in fleeing to Israel. One of the key components of Operation Tamarisk was the organization of secret airlifts, known as Operation Magic Carpet, which transported thousands of Jewish refugees from Yemen to Israel between 1949 and 1950. These airlifts were conducted in collaboration with Israeli and American authorities and played a crucial role in rescuing Yemeni Jews from persecution and facilitating their resettlement in Israel. In addition to facilitating immigration, Operation Tamarisk also focused on gathering intelligence on hostile Arab governments and terrorist organizations. Mossad agents operated covertly in countries such as Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, gathering information on military capabilities, political developments, and potential threats to Israel's security. While Operation Tamarisk remains still shrouded in secrecy, its significance in Israel's history cannot be understated. It not only facilitated the immigration of Jewish refugees to Israel, but also helped to strengthen Israel's intelligence capabilities and enhance its security in a volatile region. The Venera Program. The Venera Program stands as a remarkable chapter in the history of space exploration, particularly during the Cold War era. Spearheaded by the Soviet Union, it was dedicated to the exploration of Venus, Earth's closest planetary neighbor. Launched in the late 60s and extending into the 80s, the Venera missions represented a significant technological achievement and provided invaluable insights into the nature of Venus. One of the program's most notable accomplishments was the successful landing of spacecraft on the surface of Venus. Despite the extreme conditions of the planet's surface, such as high temperatures, crushing atmospheric pressure, and corrosive atmosphere, the Venera landers managed to survive for varying durations, transmitting data back to Earth and capturing images of the alien landscape. These missions provided humanity with its first direct observations of another planet's surface and greatly expanded our understanding of planetary science. The Moscow Signal. The Moscow Signal refers to a mysterious phenomenon observed during the Cold War, especially in the 1970s and 80s, where American intelligence agencies detected unusual radio transmissions emitting from the Soviet Union. These signals, which were initially intercepted by the National Security Agency, otherwise known as the NSA, and later corroborated by the other Western intelligence agencies, became known as the Moscow Signal due to their presumed origin in the Soviet capital. The exact nature and purpose of the Moscow Signal still remains the subject of speculation and debate among historians. Some theories suggest that these transmissions were part of a sophisticated Soviet espionage operation, possibly involving the monitoring or disruption of Western communications or the coordination of intelligence activities. Others propose that the signals could have been related to military or diplomatic activities, such as the communication between Soviet government agencies or military installations. One prevailing hypothesis is that the Moscow signal was associated with the Soviet Union's efforts to gather intelligence on Western countries, especially the United States and its NATO allies. During the Cold War, both superpowers engaged in extensive espionage activities, and this was most likely just another attempt at espionage and gathering intelligence on the other country. Reagan jokes about bombing Russia. During the height of the Cold War, jokes about the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union were not uncommon, and political figures sometimes used humor to address the seriousness of the situation, although it's arguable that this is not a good idea. Ronald Reagan, known for his wit and communication skills, occasionally made quips that touched on the sensitive topic of nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. One famous instance occurred during a sound check for a radio broadcast in 1984. Reagan joked, "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." This remark, made in jest and intended as a light-hearted aside, was not part of the official broadcast, but was inadvertently recorded and later leaked to the public. The joke sparked controversy and condemnation from some quarters, particularly among Soviet officials and political opponents who criticized Reagan for making light of nuclear warfare. However, others viewed it as a characteristic of Reagan's humor and noted that similar quips have been made by other political leaders in the past. Project Iceworm. Project Iceworm was a highly secretive and ambitious Cold War era operation conducted by the United States military in Greenland during the late 50s and early 60s. Its primary objective was to establish a network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites beneath the Greenland ice sheet, intended to serve as a deterrent against potential Soviet aggression. The project was initiated in 1959 under the auspices of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The remote and inhospitable terrain of Greenland was chosen due to its strategic proximity to the Soviet Union, allowing for the deployment of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, otherwise known as IRBMs, capable of striking targets within the Soviet territory. Additionally, the thick ice sheet provided natural cover and protection for the clandestine missile sites. To implement Project Iceworm, the U.S. military constructed a series of underground tunnels and chambers within the Greenland ice sheets, housing the necessary infrastructure for missile storage, launch control facilities, and support personnel. The operation involved extensive logistical challenges as well as engineering innovations to overcome the harsh Arctic conditions and the dynamic nature of the ice sheet. Despite initial progress, Project Iceworm faced numerous setbacks, including logistical difficulties, technological limitations, and concerns about the stability of the ice sheet. By the early 1960s, advances in reconnaissance technology had made the underground missile sites vulnerable to detection by Soviet surveillance satellites, so it was basically useless at that point. Moreover, shifting ice and geological instability posed significant risk to the integrity of the installations. Ultimately, the impracticalities and escalating costs of maintaining Project Iceworm led to its abandonment in 1966. JFK's plans on Vietnam War. John F. Kennedy's approach to the Vietnam War evolved during his presidency, and his plans for the conflict were influenced by a combination of factors, including Cold War geopolitics, domestic political considerations, and military strategy. Kennedy inherited the situation in Vietnam from his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and faced escalating tensions as North Vietnam's communist forces, the Viet Cong, grew in strength and effectiveness. Kennedy initially viewed Vietnam primarily through the lens of containment, a central tenet of U.S. Cold War policy aimed at preventing the spread of communism. He believed that a communist takeover in Vietnam could lead to an overall domino effect, with other countries in Southeast Asia falling to communism as well. As such, Kennedy increased American military assistance to South Vietnam, providing economic aid, military advisors, and equipment to bolster the government of President Ngo Dinh Diem. However, Kennedy was cautious about committing large numbers of American combat troops to Vietnam. He was wary of becoming embroiled in a protracted and unpopular war, particularly given the memory of the stalemate in Korea and the potential for escalation into a direct conflict with the Soviet Union or China. Instead, Kennedy focused on supporting counterinsurgency efforts and building up the capabilities of the South Vietnamese military to defend against the Viet Cong insurgency. In October 1963, Kennedy approved a coup that resulted in the overthrow and assassination of President Diem. amid growing dissatisfaction with his authoritarian rule and the lack of progress in the fight against the Viet Cong. However, Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 meant that he did not see his plans for Vietnam fully implemented. Lunik Satellite. The Luna, or Lunik in Russian, program was a series of unmanned Soviet spacecraft missions designed to explore the moon. The program, which began in the late 1950s and continued into the 1970s, achieved several significant milestones in space exploration, including the first human-made object to reach the moon, the first successful soft landing on the moon, and the first robotic probe to return lunar soil samples to Earth. The Lunik satellites were a key component of the Luna program, serving as the primary vehicles for lunar exploration. The first successful mission, Luna 2, launched in September 1959, became the first spacecraft to impact the lunar surface, providing valuable data about the moon's composition and confirming the absence of a lunar atmosphere. Subsequent missions in the Luna series included both flyby and lander spacecraft. Luna 3, launched in October 1959, captured the first photographs of the far side of the moon, providing humanity with its first ever glimpse of the previously unseen lunar terrain. Luna 9, launched in January 1966, achieved the first successful soft landing on the moon, transmitting images and data back to Earth from the lunar surface. Perhaps the most significant achievement of the Luna program came with Luna 16 in September 1970. This mission marked the first robotic probe to return lunar soil samples to Earth, collecting and delivering approximately 101 grams of lunar material for scientific analysis. Overall, the Lunik satellites and the Luna program as a whole played a very crucial role in advancing our understanding of the moon and laying the groundwork for future human and robotic exploration of space. 1979 Nuclear False Alarm. The 1979 nuclear false alarm, often referred to as the Vela Incident, remains one of the most concerning episodes of the Cold War era. It occurred on September 26, 1979, when the United States Vela Hotel satellite, designed to monitor compliance with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, detected a double flash of light over the South Atlantic Ocean. This flash was consistent with the characteristic signature of a nuclear detonation. The incident immediately raised alarms within the U.S. national security apparatus, as well as among its allies and adversaries. The possibility of a nuclear test conducted by either the Soviet Union or another state was considered a grave threat to global stability and security. Intensive efforts were undertaken to investigate the source of this weird flash. However, the precise cause of the event still remains unsolved to this day. Several hypotheses have been proposed, including a meteoroid impact, a satellite malfunction, or even a covert nuclear test conducted by a non-state actor or a rogue state, but the Vela incident prompted a flurry of diplomatic activity and intelligence gathering, with the United States seeking to determine the nature and origin of this mysterious flash. However, no conclusive evidence was ever found to definitively identify the cause of this event. The 1961 North Carolina Incident. The 1961 North Carolina Incident refers to a harrowing episode involving the accidental dropping of 2 nuclear bombs by a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber near Goldsboro, North Carolina, during a routine training flight. This incident occurred on January 24, 1961, at the height of the Cold War, just 3 days after John F. Kennedy's presidential inauguration. The B-52 bomber, piloted by Major Walter Scott Tulloch, experienced a catastrophic mid-air breakup while flying over North Carolina. The aircraft's structural failure resulted in the release of 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs, each with a yield estimated at approximately 4 megatons, over the town of Goldsboro and the surrounding rural area. One of the bombs deployed its parachute and activated its alarming mechanism, while the other bomb's parachute failed to deploy, causing it to crash into a muddy field. Fortunately, neither bomb detonated as a result of the accident, averting a catastrophic nuclear explosion that could have resulted in untold devastation and a loss of life. The incident remained shrouded in secrecy for many years, with the U.S. government downplaying severity and the potential consequences of a nuclear detonation. However, declassified documents and testimonies from military personnel involved in the incident have since revealed the true extent of the danger posed by the accident and the narrowly averted disaster. Edgewood Arsenal Human Experiments. The Edgewood Arsenal human experiments were a series of controversial and often secretive experiments conducted by the United States Army at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland during the Cold War era, primarily in the 1950s and 60s. These experiments involved the testing of various chemical agents and drugs on human subjects, often military personnel, to assess their effects on cognition, behavior, and physical performance. The experiments conducted at Edgewood Arsenal covered a wide range of substances, including nerve agents, psychoactive drugs, incapacitating agents, and other chemical compounds. Participants were typically volunteers who were recruited from the military and often had limited understanding of the potential risks involved. The primary goal of the experiments was to develop effective means of protecting military personnel against chemical and biological threats on the battlefield, as well as to enhance the military's understanding of the effects of these substances on human psychology and behavior. However, the ethical implications of these experiments, including issues of informed consent, participant safety, and long-term health consequences, have been the subject of significant scrutiny and criticism. Many participants in the Edgewood Arsenal experiments reported experiencing adverse effects, including physical discomfort, psychological distress, and long-term health problems. Some have alleged that they are not fully informed of the potential risks and were pressured or coerced into participating in the experiments. In the years since the experiments were conducted, efforts have been made to declassify documents and records related to Edgewood Arsenal experiments, as well as to provide medical care and compensation to affected individuals in these experiments. The mystery of Yellow Rain. The mystery of Yellow Rain refers to a controversial series of events during the 1970s and 80s involving reports of chemical warfare attacks in Southeast Asia, particularly in Laos, Cambodia, and Afghanistan. Witnesses described seeing mysterious yellow droplets falling from the sky, accompanied by symptoms of poisoning and illness among humans and animals. Initially, the United States and some Western governments accused the Soviet Union and its allies of this yellow rain and causing it to happen, including the People's Republic of China and North Vietnam, of conducting chemical warfare used as a toxin known as yellow rain. The substance was believed to be a myxotoxin produced by a fungus, possibly from the genus Fusarium, which was allegedly dispersed via aerial spraying. However, investigations and scientific analysis cast doubt on the existence of yellow rain as a chemical warfare agent. Independent studies conducted by various researchers, including biochemists and microbiologists, failed to conclusively identify any specific chemical or biological agent associated with the reported incidents of yellow rain. Instead, it was suggested that the observed phenomenon could have been caused by natural sources such as pollen, bee feces, or other organic matter, which can appear yellow and be dispersed by wind or other atmospheric conditions. Furthermore, some experts argue that the symptoms reported by alleged victims could be attributed to other factors including psychological stress, environmental toxins, or pre-existing health conditions. Korean War UFO. During the Korean War, there were reports of unidentified flying objects observed by both military personnel and civilians in the vicinity of the conflict zone. These sightings, while often anecdotal and lacking any sort of concrete evidence, they contributed to the broader cultural fascination of UFOs during the Cold War era. Accounts of UFO sightings during the Korean War varied widely, ranging from reports of strange lights in the sky to more elaborate descriptions of aerial maneuvers and encounters with unconventional aircraft. Some witnesses claimed to have observed UFOs exhibiting characteristics beyond the capabilities of known human technology, such as high-speed movements, sudden changes in direction, and the ability to hover or disappear from view. One notable incident occurred in 1951 when U.S. Air Force pilots flying missions over Korea reported encountering unidentified objects that appeared to be flying in formation and exhibiting erratic behavior. These sightings were investigated by military authorities, but no definitive explanation was ever provided. The prevalence of UFO sightings during the Korean War can be attributed to a combination of factors, including heightened military activity, technological advancements in aviation, and the psychological stress and uncertainty of wartime conditions. Project Azorian. Project Azorian, also known as Glomar Explorer Project, was a classified Cold War-era operation conducted by the United States CIA with the goal of recovering a sunken Soviet submarine, K-1229, from the depths of the Pacific Ocean. The project took place in the 70s and was one of the most ambitious and technologically advanced covert operations in history. The Soviet submarine K-129 sank in March 1968, approximately 1,500 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii, under mysterious circumstances. The U.S. Navy detected the submarine's loss and conducted an extensive search for the wreckage, but the submarine's exact location remained unknown. In 1968, the CIA began planning Project Azorian as a means of recovering the sunken submarine and its valuable intelligence assets, including codebooks, cryptographic equipment, and nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. The agency enlisted the services of the Howard Hughes-owned ship, the Glomar Explorer, which was retrofitted with specialized equipment, including a massive claw-like apparatus known as the capture vehicle, designed to lift the submarine from the ocean floor. In 1974, the Glomar Explorer embarked on its mission to the recovery site, located approximately 3 miles below the ocean surface. Despite encountering numerous technical setbacks and challenges during the operation, including the accidental loss of a portion of the submarine's hull during the recovery attempt, the Glomar Explorer successfully retrieved a portion of K-129's wreckage. However, due to a mechanical failure, the capture vehicle was only able to recover a small section of the submarine, containing some components and the remains of several crew members. The CIA claimed that the project was a partial success, as it obtained valuable intelligence materials from the recovered section of the submarine, including 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and a cryptographic equipment. Project Azorian remained classified for decades, with details of the operation gradually emerging through declassified documents and disclosures. The project's scale, secrecy, and technological innovation have made it a subject of fascination and a study among historians. Project Popeye. Operation Popeye was a classified military operation conducted by the United States during the Vietnam War. The operation took place from 1967 to 1972 and involved cloud seeding techniques to extend the monsoon season over targeted areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. The primary objective of Operation Popeye was to increase rainfall over the targeted regions, thereby creating muddy and impassable road conditions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a key supply route used by the North Vietnamese Army to transport troops and supplies to South Vietnam. By disrupting enemy logistics and transportation networks, the United States hoped to hinder the flow of personnel and material to communist forces in South Vietnam, thereby gaining a strategic advantage in the conflict. Cloud seeding, the technique employed in Operation Popeye, involves the dispersal of silver iodide or other agents into clouds to induce precipitation. Aircraft, typically modified military aircraft, would release cloud seeding agents into the atmosphere, where they would mix with existing moisture and simulate the formation of rain or snow. Operation Popeye faced several logistical, technical, and ethical challenges, including concerns about the environmental impact of cloud seeding, the unpredictability of weather patterns, and the potential for unintended consequences, such as flooding or damage to civilian infrastructure. Although, despite these challenges, Operation Popeye continued for several years with mixed results. While some missions reportedly succeeded in increasing rainfall and creating adverse weather conditions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the overall effectiveness of the operation remains a subject of debate among historians and military analysts. Some argue that Operation Popeye had a limited impact on enemy operations, while others contend that it contributed to the disruption of North Vietnamese supply lines and logistical networks. In 1972, the existence of Operation Popeye was revealed to the public through investigation reporting, leading to widespread controversy and criticism. The operation raised questions about ethics, about whether to use weather modification as a tool for warfare, and prompted calls for greater transparency and accountability in military operations. Alright, now on to Tier 5, starting off with Acoustic Kitty. Acoustic Kitty was a bizarre and ambitious attempt by the CIA during the Cold War era to use cats as covert listening devices. The project was initiated in the 60s as part of the agency's efforts to gather intelligence on Soviet targets without arousing any sort of suspicion. The idea was to surgically implant listening devices into cats and train them to eavesdrop onto conversations. The CIA believed that cats, being naturally curious and able to move stealthily, could blend into urban environments and get close to their targets without raising any sort of alarms. The plan involved implanting a microphone in the cat's ear canal, a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a thin wire antenna along its spine, allowing it to transmit audio recordings back to handlers. However, the project faced numerous challenges. The first hurdle was training the cats to behave as needed for espionage purposes. Cats, as independent creatures, proved to be very difficult to control and train effectively for such a task. Furthermore, the technical aspects of the implants were problematic. The devices were bulky and cumbersome, causing discomfort to the cats and affecting their natural movements. There were also difficulties in reliability transmitting and receiving signals from the implanted device. After spending millions of dollars and several years on the project, the CIA eventually abandoned Acoustic Kitty in the 1970s. Frank Olson. Frank Olson was a biochemist and Central Intelligence Agency employee who became embroiled in one of the most controversial incidents of the Cold War era. Born in 1910, Olson joined the United States Army during World War II and later worked for the Army Biological Warfare Laboratories in the early 50s. He joined the CIA's Technical Services staff, where he worked on research related to biological warfare and mind control experiments, including the notorious MK-Ultra program. In November 1953, Olson was involved in a secret CIA program called MK-Ultra, which aimed to develop techniques for mind control and interrogation. During a retreat at a remote cabin in Maryland, Olson was covertly administered LSD without his knowledge as part of an experiment. This experience deeply disturbed him, leading to severe mental breakdown. A week later, on November 28, 1953, Olson fell to his death from the window of a hotel room in New York City. The circumstances surrounding his death were initially ruled a S-word, but over the years suspicions arose that he may have been murdered. In 1975, following investigations and inquiries, the US government admitted that Olson's death was likely a homicide and issued a formal apology to his family. The Olson case shed light on the CIA's secretive and often ethically dubious activities during the Cold War, particularly its experimentation with mind-altering drugs and interrogation techniques. Bulgarian umbrella. The Bulgarian umbrella is not just an ordinary umbrella, it's a symbol of Cold War espionage and intrigue. The term refers to an umbrella modified to conceal a small mechanism that could inject a tiny pellet containing poison into a person. This umbrella played a sinister role in one of the most notorious assassination plots of the Cold War. In 1978, Bulgarian dissident Georgy Makarov was living in London, where he worked for the BBC World Service and openly criticized the Bulgarian communist regime of Todor Zhikov. On September 7, 1978, while waiting at a bus stop on Waterloo Bridge, Markov felt a sharp pain in his leg, as if he had been stung by an insect. He turned around to see a man picking up an umbrella and getting into a taxi. Markov later fell ill and died in a London hospital. His death attributed to poisoning by ricin, a deadly toxin. The Bulgarian umbrella quickly became associated with Markov's assassination, although the exact identity of his assailant and the involvement of the Bulgarian government has never been definitively proven. However, suspicion fell on the Bulgarian Secret Service, with allegations that they cooperated with the Soviet KGB in orchestrating the assassination. Vasily Arkhipov. Vasily Arkhipov was a Soviet naval officer who played a crucial role in preventing a nuclear catastrophe during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the worst moments of the Cold War. Born in 1926 in the Soviet Union, Arkhipov served as the second in command aboard the Soviet submarine B-59, which was part of Flota dispatched in Cuba in 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reached a fever pitch when the US discovered the Soviet Union had secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as we've talked about multiple times in this video so far. But in response, the US imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, and both superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear war. On October 27, 1962, the B-59 came under attack by US Navy vessels near Cuba. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the submarine had been submerged for several days and had lost contact with Moscow, believing that war may have already broken out between the US and the Soviet Union. The captain of the B-59, Valenty Savitsky, ordered the submarine to surface and prepare to launch a nuclear torpedo at the American ships. However, Arkhipov, as the flotilla's political officer and a high-ranking officer, had the authority to veto the launch of nuclear weapons. He courageously refused to authorize the use of the nuclear torpedo, insisting that the decision to deploy nuclear weapons required the unanimous consent of all 3 senior officers on board. His intervention prevented a potentially catastrophic escalation of the crisis and helped avert nuclear war. So, basically, this guy may have saved your life, because if it wasn't for him, it could have broken out into a full-scale nuclear war and ended basically everyone. Bombing of Cambodia. The bombing of Cambodia was a significant military campaign conducted by the United States during the Vietnam War, which occurred between 1965 and 1973. It was part of the broader strategy to disrupt North Vietnamese supply routes and military infrastructure, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads and paths used by North Vietnamese to transport troops and supplies through neighboring Laos and Cambodia. The bombing of Cambodia began in earnest in 1969 under the administration of President Richard Nixon and continued until 1973. Initially conducted covertly without the knowledge of the American public or Congress, the campaign eventually escalated into massive aerial bombardment involving B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and other aircraft. The bombings had overall devastating consequences for Cambodia, exacerbating for instability caused by the Vietnam War, and then contributing to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a communist insurgency movement led by Pol Pot, and that didn't go well. The bombings killed tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians and displaced many more, fueling resentment and anti-American sentiment in the country. So, not a good move by America in any means. Despite the scale of the bombing campaign, its effectiveness in achieving its stated objectives remains a subject of debate, while many people say it was not worth the amount of lives lost. Operation Baby Lift. Operation Baby Lift was a large-scale evacuation effort conducted by the United States government in April 1975 during the final days of the Vietnam War. It aimed to evacuate as many as possible of the estimated 2,000 orphans from South Vietnam, many of whom were all mixed American and Vietnamese descent. Before the fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese forces, the operation was prompted by the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam, with the North Vietnamese advancing rapidly and the imminent collapse of the South Vietnamese government. Concerned by the safety of the orphans, as well as other vulnerable groups, the U.S. government launched Operation Baby Lift as part of a broader effort to evacuate American citizens and South Vietnamese allies from the country. Beginning on April 4, 1975, a series of flights, primarily using military transport aircraft, were organized to airlift children from orphanages in Saigon to the United States and other countries. The operation was carried out under challenging circumstances, with the threat of enemy fire and logistical difficulties complicating the evacuation efforts. Tragically, though, the operation was marred by a devastating accident on April 4th, when a Lockheed C-5A Galaxy aircraft carrying 243 passengers, including 78 children, crashed shortly after takeoff from Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon. The crash resulted in the deaths of 138 people, including 78 children and many American aid workers and military personnel. Although, despite this tragedy, Operation Baby Lift did continue, and over the course of 10 days, approximately 2,500 children were evacuated to the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. Operation Baby Lift received significant media attention and sparked both praise for its humanitarian arms and criticism for its rushed and chaotic execution, but in the end, it did save a lot of people, so that's good. Operation Condor. Operation Condor was a covert multinational intelligence operation conducted by several South American countries, primarily in the 70s and 80s. The operation was aimed at coordinating efforts among these countries to monitor, persecute, and eliminate political opponents, particularly left-wing dissidents, guerrillas, and perceived threats to their authoritarian regimes. The participating countries in Operation Condor included Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil, with the support and backing of the United States government, which viewed leftist movements in Latin America as a threat to its interests during the Cold War. Under Operation Condor, intelligence agencies from these countries exchanged information, collaborated on surveillance and intelligence gathering, and engaged in cross-border operations to track down and eliminate political opponents. The operation involved widespread human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, torture, and political repression. So, not good things. One of the most infamous incidents associated with Operation Condor was the assassination of former Chilean foreign minister and his American assistant in 1976 in Washington, D.C. This act of terrorism on American soil exposed the extent of the collaboration between South American dictatorships and raised international awareness of the human rights abuses committed under Operation Condor. Operation Condor gradually declined in the 80s as democratic transitions took place in several South American countries, and international pressure mounted to investigate and prosecute these responsible for human rights violations. However, its legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the region, with many victims still seeking justice for the crimes committed during this dark period of South American history. Chairman Mao embarrasses Khrushchev in the pool. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev went to China in 1958. It was during the early stages of the Sino-Soviet split, a period marked by increasing tensions and ideological differences between the communist powers of the Soviet Union and China. Although, during Khrushchev's visit, was meant to showcase solidarity and cooperation between the two communist nations, a swimming event was organized. According to accounts from that time, Chairman Mao, known for his skill in swimming, challenged Khrushchev to race in a pool. Khrushchev was not known for his athleticism, reluctantly accepted the challenge. However, Mao proceeded to embarrass Khrushchev by swimming underwater for an extended period, demonstrating his superior swimming ability and leaving Khrushchev struggling to keep up. This incident was seen as a symbolic victory for Mao and a demonstration of China's growing confidence and assertiveness on the world stage, particularly in its relations with the Soviet Union. But definitely a funny part of history that a lot of this sort of stuff kind of goes under the radar, but I'm glad it's being highlighted in this iceberg because more like human, when you can view leaders as more human. Both of those leaders weren't good, by the way. They killed a lot of people in their leaderships, but it's good to see them on more of a human level, I guess, if you get what I'm saying. All right, now into tier 6. Stalin analyzed Mao's poop. Yeah, you heard that right. Joseph Stalin did actually analyze Mao's poop. Anyways, let's get into this. It's true that during Stalin's rule, there were reports of meticulous analysis of various aspects of Mao Zedong's life, including his bodily functions, and along with that, his poop. While there isn't a comprehensive, well-documented account of Stalin personally analyzing Mao's feces, there were instances where Soviet intelligence and medical personnel were tasked with gathering detailed information about Mao's health and habits. During the early years of the Cold War, the Soviet Union closely monitored Mao's health and behavior, as China's Communist Party was a crucial ally. Stalin's regime, like many totalitarian states, maintained extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering operations, and this included monitoring the well-being of foreign leaders. Mao's health was of particular interest to Stalin and Soviet intelligence due to his potential impact on China's stability and its alignment with Soviet interests. Reports suggest that Mao's health and personal habits, including his diet and bodily functions, were scrutinized as part of this intelligence gathering effort. While it may seem unusual or even absurd by today's standards, such practices were not uncommon during the Cold War, where information was seen as a valuable tool for understanding and influencing geopolitical developments. 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisonings. The Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisonings of 1951 remains one of the most mysterious and disturbing incidents of its kind. This event unfolded in the small town of Pont Saint-Esprit in southern France, where hundreds of people experienced bizarre and terrifying symptoms after consuming bread from local bakeries. Beginning on August 15, 1951, residents of Pont Saint-Esprit started exhibiting symptoms such as hallucinations, delirium, convulsions, and violent behavior. Some victims reported seeing visions of snakes, dragons, and fire, while others experienced intense paranoia and psychosis. The outbreak resulted in 5 deaths and left hundreds more hospitalized or suffering from long-term neurological damage. At the time, there was widespread speculation about the cause of the mass poisoning. Some initially blamed ergot poisoning, a condition caused by consuming rye contaminated with ergot fungus, which can induce hallucinations and other symptoms. However, subsequent investigations do cast doubt on this theory, as not all affected individuals had consumed rye-based products. Over the years, various different theories have emerged regarding the case of the Pont Saint-Esprit poisonings. Some have suggested deliberate poisoning by government agents or foreign operatives as part of some sort of covert operation, while others have speculated about accidental contamination or industrial pollution. However, no explanation has ever been established, and the incident remains shrouded in mystery, but definitely interesting and really weird nonetheless. Carl Sagan was hired to nuke the moon. Yeah, they actually did think about nuking the moon.
Together, we will steal the moon!
This actually has some basis in reality, so let's get into it. The idea of nuking the moon sounds like something of science fiction, but in reality, it had some basis in some real government plans during the Cold War era. Carl Sagan, a renowned astrophysicist and science communicator, was not hired to nuke the moon himself, but he did propose a related concept. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, amidst the tensions of the Cold War and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were discussions within the US government about potential ways to demonstrate American technological prowess and intimidate the Soviet Union. One such proposal involved detonating a nuclear bomb on the moon, which is just ridiculous. The idea was to launch a spacecraft, possibly a converted intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead attached, and then deliberately crash it into the moon's surface. The resulting explosion would have been visible from Earth and could have served as a dramatic display of American military and scientific capabilities. I mean, this is like the stuff they were thinking about and doing in the Cold War was ridiculous. This is why I had to make an iceberg on it. It's so interesting. Carl Sagan, then a young scientist, was involved in the proposal to some extent. He worked as a consultant on the feasibility of the project and helped calculate the potential scientific and military benefits of such an event. And, however, Sagan was reportedly skeptical of the idea and raised concerns about the potential environmental and ethical implications of detonating a nuclear bomb in space. Ultimately, the plan to nuke the moon was deemed too risky and provocative, and it was never carried out. Instead, both the United States and the Soviet Union focused their efforts on less controversial aspects of the space race, such as landing humans on the moon, which is probably the better option than just nuking the moon. Air Force using drugged bears to test ejector seats. That seems like that sentence has never been put together before, but that's actually something. The Air Force did use drugged bears to test ejector seats. God, this final tier is so good. During the Cold War, particularly in the 50s and 60s, there were some unconventional experiments conducted by various military organizations, including the United States Air Force. One such experiment involved testing ejector seats using bears. The concept behind using bears in ejector seats testing was to simulate the physical effects on ejection from an aircraft on a living organism that shared a similar weight and size to human pilots, although, in my personal opinion, I think bears are a little bit bigger, but who knows. Bears were chosen for their size and weight, which were closer to that of adult humans compared to smaller animals like mice or rats. These tests typically involve strapping the bears into specially designed ejection seats and subjecting them to simulated ejections, either on the ground or in specially modified aircraft. Instruments attached to the bear would record data on the forces experienced during ejection, such as acceleration, deceleration, and the impact of parachute deployment. While the idea of using bears in such experiments may seem unusual or controversial, it was not uncommon for military organizations to do some goofy stuff back then, but once again, they were doing some crazy stuff. Goes from drugging bears and putting them into ejector seats and nuking the moon. God, the Cold War era was crazy. Khrushchev barred from visiting Disneyland. In 1959, during the height of the Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, there was indeed an incident where the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, was reportedly barred from visiting Disneyland in California. Khrushchev was in the United States for a diplomatic visit, which included meetings with then-President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The story goes that during the visit, Khrushchev expressed interest in visiting Disneyland, the iconic theme park in California. However, due to the security concerns and logistics issues, his request to visit Disneyland was denied by US authorities. The reasons for denying Khrushchev visit to Disneyland were primarily related to security considerations as accommodating such a high-profile visitor would have required extensive security measures and could have posed logistical challenges for the park. The incident became a symbol of the ideological divide once again, and that's just a funny story that the Soviet Union leader was kind of banned from visiting the Disneyland. Definitely a unique, funny story. Operation Sea Spray. Operation Sea Spray was a covert military experiment conducted by the United States Navy in 1950. The operation involved the release of microscopic organisms into the atmosphere over the city of San Francisco. The goal was to simulate a biological attack and study the potential spread of biological agents by air currents. In September 1950, the Navy deployed a Navy minesweeper named the USS Norton Sound to release the bacteria, which is called Serrata marcenius, a non-pathogenic microorganism, into the air. The bacteria were released in a spray form using a hose attached to the ship's exhaust system. The Navy wanted to assess the vulnerability of American cities to biological warfare and understand how a real biological attack might unfold. However, the operation had unintended consequences. While S. marcescens is generally harmless to healthy individuals, it can cause infections in people with weakened immune systems or underlying health conditions. Within days of the operation, numerous residents of San Francisco reported mysterious respiratory ailments, urinary tract infections, and other health issues. At the time, the public was unaware of the true nature of Operation Sea Spray, and the Navy did not disclose its involvement in the incident. The aftermath of Operation Sea Spray raised questions about the use of unsuspecting civilians in military experiments and the potential risks associated with biological warfare research. Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird was a program conducted by the United States CIA during the Cold War era. The operation aimed to influence domestic and foreign media organizations to promote narratives favorable to the U.S. government's interests and counter communist propaganda. Beginning in the early 1950s and continuing for several decades, Operation Mockingbird involved the recruitment of journalists, editors, and publishers from major news outlets, including newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and television networks. These individuals were often covertly paid or provided with other incentives to produce news stories, articles, and broadcasts that aligned with the CIA's objectives. The operation encompassed a range of tactics, including the dissemination of propaganda, the planting of false or misleading information, and the suppression of stories deemed detrimental to U.S. interests. Through its extensive network of contacts with the media industry, the CIA sought to shape public opinion both domestically and internationally, especially in countries where the spread of communism posed a perceived threat to American interests. Operation Mockingbird operated in secrecy for many years, and its full extent and impact remained the subject of speculation and controversy. While some historians and researchers assert that the program significantly influenced media coverage and public perception during the Cold War, others argue that it may have had an impact that wasn't that detrimental to anything. So some people believe it was a big impact, and some people believe it didn't have much of an impact at all. Starfish Prime was a high-altitude nuclear test conducted by the United States on July 9th. Starfish Prime was a high-altitude nuclear test conducted by the United States on July 9th, 1962, as part of Operation Fishbowl, a series of tests aimed at studying the effects of nuclear explosions in the Earth's upper atmosphere and space. It was one of the most powerful nuclear tests ever conducted by the U.S. The test involved the detonation of a 1.4 megaton thermonuclear warhead at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers, which is about 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean near Johnston Atoll. The explosion created a massive burst of electromagnetic energy, generating an intense burst of gamma rays and triggering a phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse. The EMP produced by Starfish Prime had far-reaching consequences. It caused electrical disturbances in Hawaii, located about 900 miles away from the detonation site, leading to malfunctions in streetlights, communication systems, and electrical equipment. The effects of the EMP also extended into space, disrupting the operation of satellites and other spacecraft in low Earth orbit. While Starfish Prime provided valuable data for military and scientific purposes, it also showed how dangerous it was to nuclear test in the upper atmosphere and space, and just anywhere on Earth basically. Reagan and Gorbachev's alien invasion plans. While it's a popular urban legend that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had plans to collaborate in the event of an alien invasion, There's little to no evidence to support these claims, but let's just speculate, because it's more fun to do that than just disprove it. The idea seems to have originated from a speech given by Reagan to the United Nations General Assembly in 1987, where he mentioned the hypothetical scenario of an alien threat as a way to illustrate the need for global cooperation and unity in the face of common challenges. In his speech, Reagan famously said, "I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world." Some have interpreted this statement as evidence that Reagan believed in the possibility of extraterrestrial life and had discussed plans with Gorbachev for how he responded to such a threat. However, there's no indication that Reagan and Gorbachev ever engaged in serious conversations about this and coordinated a response to alien invasion, but this speech was likely intended as a rhetorical device rather than a reflection of actual policy or planning. But it's fun to theorize that Reagan and Gorbachev sat inside a room one day and were like, what would we do if aliens tried to attack Earth? The Cold War never ended. Now, this one's pretty simple. It's basically just talking about the Cold War never ended, kind of. The Cold War ended supposedly around the 1990s, but it's kind of still going on today because Russia and the US still have some problems that I think they need to sort out, and those things have never really been sorted out before, so the Cold War is still kind of happening, especially with Ukraine and Russia right now, and the US backing Ukraine, all that stuff. So the Cold War is kind of still happening, but it's like less serious, I guess. And I think that was a good one to leave it off on. The Cold War never ended? Maybe. Let me know what you think down below. So we've been yapping about the Cold War Iceberg for a while. I really hope you enjoyed. And thank you for watching to the end, if you're still watching. And yeah, if you're still watching, I mean, subscribe and like the video. You obviously liked it enough to stay the whole 2 hours and 40 minutes. So yeah, until next time, see ya.